Okay, um, I'd like to start a bit before the Beis Hamikdash is even destroyed in regards to the Jewish history, because that will give a lot of the context for why Achashverosh was acting the way he did, as well as Haman and many of the Babylonians too. So one of the main reasons why there was such confusion and why Achashverosh, one of the main reasons why he did a feast, is because everyone thought. Hello?
Go ahead, we're hearing you.
You're
Okay.
fine.
Because everyone thought there was a huge problem. Everyone thought there was a different method for deciding till when the next Beis Hamikdash will be built and what it actually means. Because the prophet Yirmiyah, or as he's known in English, Jeremiah, prophesied that after 70 years, Babylonians would be destroyed and the Jews would be redeemed. So most Jews and most of the non-Jews as well thought, obviously, when they're saying the Jews will be redeemed, what does that mean? That we'll have the Beis Hamikdash back and we'll be in our homeland again. That's obviously what they thought. But everyone took when the Yirmiyahu said after 70 years to mean different things. Some people thought it was as soon as the king Yehoiachin got deposed, was the second to last king of Judea. Some people thought it was when the Beis Hamikdash got destroyed. And some other people thought it was from 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar, the person who would lead to the Beis Hamikdash being destroyed, took the throne of the Babylonian kingdom. So that's the reason for a lot of the confusion that would end up going on later in the Purim story, and the reason why Achashverosh was so frightened of the Jews, and the reason why many of the Jews despaired and thought and became, as we know in the famous feast that Achashverosh had, many of them ate non-kosher and stopped caring about Judaism, is because they thought the prophecy is a lie. Even Yirmiyah, our greatest prophet, was inaccurate. So to go back, I'm just going to give an overview of the secular history of this time period. Before the Babylonians came the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were one of the most brutal empires throughout world history. Most empires brag about the things that they built or the places they conquered. The Assyrians bragged about all the horrible things they did to the other people that they conquered. There's many paintings throughout Assyrian temples and history that archaeologists have unearthed, which shows the Assyrians, everyone else is cataloging the immense wealth that they own, or the great buildings they built, or the amazing things they learned, or the places they traveled. What do the Assyrians have on the side of their temples and palaces? Pictures of their kings torturing other people, oftentimes children. So they were a very brutal empire, and they affected the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes. They conquered all those places. They also conquered the Jews. The 10 lost tribes of Israel were taken away by an Assyrian king and never heard from again. So the Assyrians and their harsh brutality actually led to the Babylonians revolting. The Babylonians realized that they couldn't defeat the Assyrians by themselves, so they allied with an unknown kingdom outside of the borders of Iraq and Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means the land between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is modern-day Iraq and parts of Syria. And they asked the king of the Medes, the first king of the Medes, which is in Hebrew Madai, would they ally with them against the Assyrians? So the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and the Babylonian who did this was the father of Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonians and the Medians attacked the Assyrians. The Babylonians got pushed back, and the Medians destroyed the city of Ashur, which was the capital of Assyria. And then afterwards, they went to the famous city of Nineveh and Yonah, which was the greatest city of the time, and by far the most wealthiest city in the world, perhaps in the next 1,000 years, was destroyed by both the Babylonians and the Medians. And they divided the Assyrian Empire. They didn't conquer the rest of it yet, but they made an agreement that you'll take this half of the empire, and we'll take the other half. Who cares what the subject people ask for? We're going to do it anyway. So that's what ended up happening. The Medians took the north, nowhere close to the Jewish lands, but they ended up taking this small land called Persia, which spoke a very similar language to them. And they also, the Medians took the north, Persia, parts of Armenia, northern Syria, and parts of Turkey. And the Babylonians said, we'll take the south, Egypt, Israel, and southern Syria and Arabia. And they went out to fulfill their conquests. The Medians ended up trying to take all of it, but they got pushed back at the border of a place called Lydia, which is western Turkey. And the Babylonians, we know the famous story of what happened when the Babylonians attacked Yehuda. They first attacked them, and they deposed the first king who they attacked. His name was Yehoiakim. His son was appointed right afterwards, and the Babylonians didn't like it because they wanted to be able to choose who would be king of Judea. So they right away attacked his son Yechaniah, otherwise known as Yehoiachin. And they took him away and poked out his eyes and took him prisoner and brought him to Babylonia. And they appointed Tzidkiyahu. He was Yechaniah's uncle. And right at that time, Tzidkiyahu got appointed king. And for a while, he was loyal to the Babylonians because they made him king and because he was afraid of them. But eventually, he also revolted, even though Yirmiyahu warned him not to, because Yirmiyahu said he didn't have the strength to revolt, and the Beis Hamikdash would be destroyed when he did. So Tzidkiyahu threw him into a dungeon. Anywho, the Babylonians came back, and this time they completely destroyed Judea. And the first time they invaded, by the times of Yehoiakim, all they did was take some members of the royal family as hostage. When they came back to fight when Yechaniah was king, they took him and most of the important men and the learned men of the courts. That's why many people thought that 70 years will come back, it will be during the times of Yechaniah, because a large portion of the Jews were already taken during Yechaniah's exile. All the great Jews like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, all these great names, and Yecheskel as well, they were all taken during the times of Yechaniah because they were all the learned men, and Babylon wanted to weaken the Jews forever. So how do you weaken a strong country? You take away all the people who run the country, the bureaucrats, the people who teach the other people, and the soldiers. So that's what Babylonia did. And that, because many people would think, obviously the 70 years goes by when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, but many of the people said, return. We were away from Eretz Yisrael much longer than that, from Yechaniah's exile. So after they took Tzidkiyahu, there's all these famous stories with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel prophesizing that Babylonia would end and be taken over by an empire of silver. So Babylonia was called the Empire of Gold because the wealth was all brought back to one city, Babylon. So it was extremely wealthy. It was extremely wealthy at the expense of the rest of their empire. The Persian Empire ended up being called the Empire of Silver in the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel interpreted, because they spread out the wealth. Persia was more strategic than Babylon. Babylon was brutal and cruel. They took after Assyria in that aspect. Hello? Hello?
Can you mute people? You know how to mute?
Yeah.
Do it, please.
All right. All right.
Go ahead.
So at this point, many people were wondering what would be the empire, because Daniel didn't say which empire. He just said an empire of silver would take them over. So many people were wondering, how would anyone defeat Babylonia? The Medes were allies with Babylonia. They would never fight. And the reason was, even though the Medes disliked how the Babylonians operated it, they still respected them. And in the ancient world, people were very loyal to their oaths. They made an oath together to always be allies because of the Assyrians. So they couldn't betray the Babylonians at all. And this is where Achashverosh's grandfather comes into the story. His English name is Cyrus, but throughout this time, we're going to call him Kodesh, because that's what the Persians called him back then, and that's also what the Jews called him. The only people who call him Cyrus are English historians from nowadays and Greeks. So Koresh, as I explained in the beginning, Media conquered most parts of the northern Assyrian Empire, and they also took a vassal kingdom. A vassal kingdom is where they still ruled it, but they let the place still have a king. So they took the vassal kingdom of Persia, which is in modern day, which had two cities, Anshan and Susa. Susa is famous as Shushan. There's many ways of pronouncing the city. So it was a small little kingdom, but they spoke a very similar language to the modern day, those days Medians. So they were very close, and many times the Persian royal family would intermarry with the Median royal family. It was at this point that the Median royal family had a king named Astyages. The problem was, as a king, he had a huge problem. He didn't have any sons. He only had one daughter. And as an agreement by his father made an agreement with the grandfather of the king of Persia, that someone from his royal family would marry into their royal family. So Astyages gave his daughter to the king of Persia at that time. The king of Persia was no threat. He owned a much smaller kingdom than the kingdom of Media. But the problem was, there's many opinions for what happened. The problem was, he got very scared and very angry. He didn't want his daughter to have a son. He got very angry when he found out that she had a son, because this son could threaten him. He was the only other member of the royal family who was alive. So he commanded his son-in-law and his daughter to kill their child. They said they couldn't do it, even though they were afraid of him. They couldn't kill their own son. So he sent his general into the land, and the Persians had no chance of fighting him. So they gave away the young prince who didn't have a name at that point yet, and they gave him to the general. The general was supposed to kill him, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. So what did he do? He took him to the middle of the woods, and this is according to Midrashim and also stories by the Persians themselves.
Seduce a tu hermanastra cachonda o follate a tu madrastra pervertida.
Hello? Guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. We don't know who's
And hear you and
speaking over
everybody
you.
else.
All right. So to continue from what we were saying, he dropped him off in the middle of the woods, and he left him out to die, the young boy. So luckily, a dog ended up raising the boy. I guess it fed him and also raised him. So he lived in the woods. And at about 4 years of age or 5 years of age, he was picked up by a group of bandits. And the famous thing about Koresh is, when he was a baby, he had a very famous birthmark on the back of his arm that was very distinct. So if he was alive, if he was able to be found, people would know about it. So what ended up happening is he was raised by these bandits and ended up ruling them in this mountain. The general who was supposed to kill him got sent by the king Astyages to march into the woods and take care of this bandit rebel who's disturbing the trade routes in his kingdom. The general captured Koresh, killed most of his bandits, but when he was about to kill him, he saw that famous birthmark, and he realized this was the exact same woods that he dropped off the little boy in. So he thought it was an act of providence, or back then people were very, very much believed in fate. It was like a very common thing in the olden days that something happened, it must be fate, so they had to follow it. It actually says in Gemara that the Goyim very often believe in the stars. Whatever the stars say, that's what they follow. They don't have their own sets of principles. So what ended up happening is he said it must be fate, and he joined Koresh in a revolt against his grandfather. Koresh easily got appointed king of Persia. His father stepped down and let Koresh become king because he was just happy to see his son alive. And many in the royal court were actually, even in the Median royal court, were actually loyal to Koresh. One of the reasons for this was because he was half Median. He was from the Median royal family. So they didn't even think of it as a revolt against the Median royal family. They just thought of it as an eternal dispute. And they're like, which king do we like more, Astyages or Koresh? And Astyages, as we see, he was a very cruel man, willing to kill his own grandchild. So he was a very unpopular in the Persian kingdom. And now that they had an alternative, it was a very brief civil war, and Astyages got captured and locked away in a tower, and Koresh became king. But it wasn't right away very easy. As soon as Koresh became king, Babylonians realized exactly what was happening, and they made an alliance with the kingdom of Lydia. As I explained, the kingdom of Lydia was a place in West Turkey, which even clashed with the previous Median kings. And the Babylonians realized now that Koresh never was part of this oath, because he's descended from the Persians. He never joined in the oath that the Babylonians and the Medians will protect each other. He was actually the king of the Persian Median Empire, not just the Median Empire. So the Babylonians and Lydians made an agreement to defend each other against Koresh and his forces. The thing about it is, the Babylonians under Belshazzar, this was Nebuchadnezzar's second son, were gathering their forces, but Belshazzar wasn't really worried. As explained, he thought the 70 years was from when his father became king. Nebuchadnezzar became king 70 years ago. So he actually had a banquet, the famous banquet with the handwriting on the wall. That banquet was because he thought the 70 years were over, so that the Persians would lose, and the Jews' prophecy was wrong. As I explained, many of the Goyim back then were very nervous with the Jews, not just because of their almost successful revolts, but also because the idea of one God who wasn't depicted in any way was completely foreign to them. So they got very nervous whenever the Jews were talking about their one God and their prophecies, and they didn't like it. First of all, because the Jewish God, unlike all the other gods all the other idols in those days, there was no semblance of him. You couldn't see, they didn't create an idol of him. And also, everywhere else, whenever you conquered any other nation, the way you made them join you is you said, your idol is also part of our pantheon. You could join our pantheon. You're just a lesser group of people, and your God is a lesser God, that you could join our pantheon. The Jews were the only ones who completely rejected this. They're like, no, our God's not part of your pantheon. He's the only God, and he can't be depicted, and he's the Jewish God. It's nothing else. So the Babylonians very much didn't like the Jews and how they operated. So he was making a feast, and he gloated that it's over. I'm safe. The Babylonian Empire will last. But it was that night that the Koresh and his army invaded Babylonia, took the city, killed Belshazzar, and his brother, Nabonidus, which was another king of Babylon, got appointed to Koresh's court. The thing about this is, how were the Medes and Persians able to How were the Medes and Persians able How were the Medes and Persians able to conquer Babylonia? Everyone thought that the Medes and Persians would have to fight against Lydia. So the thing about it is, and they thought they'd have to try to attack Lydia and fight them, and sieges take a long time. So how was Koresh able to go so quickly to Babylonia if he was trying to besiege the Lydian capital? Well, the thing that happened was the king of Lydia, his name was Croesus, he went to this person who he thought was a prophetess. She was called the Oracle of Delphi, which was a lady from Greece. He thought she was a prophetess, so he asked her, "What should I do? Should I attack or defend?" So she said, "If you cross the river, the Euphrates River, a great empire will fall." So he took it to mean that he'd win. So he right away crossed the river with his whole army, no one to defend his homeland, and he fought Koresh in his lands in a major battle. And Koresh obviously had the home advantage. So Koresh easily defeated him in a major battle, and then took Lydia in 3 days tops. It was very quick. And he right away went and attacked Babylonia in the middle of the night. by diverting their water supply. So, because Babylonia was surrounded on one side was surrounded by a river, so he actually dammed the river and crossed from that side to attack the city. And there was no guards on that wall because no one thought people would attack from across a river when they could attack from the other side. So Koresh easily took the city, and while he was taking the city, one of his guards, some opinions say it was Achashverosh himself, found the princess of Babylonia, Vashti, who was only 8 years old at the time. And she was right away captured. And she was captured, and she was going to be married off to one of the royals of the Persian family. It wasn't decided who. They'd wait till she was a bit older, but it was great luck that they captured her. So what ended up happening is then Koresh took large parts of the rest of the Middle East and took Israel. And Koresh actually is mentioned in Tanakh as he's the only non-Jew who's mentioned as Mashiach. Mashiach doesn't mean what the Messiah as we know it nowadays when it mentions it in Tanakh. Mashiach means anyone who was anointed by God and given and who got their power from God, and God was happy with them having their power. So the reason why he was called that was, first of all, he right away tore up the law that the Babylonians had for years and years, which was the Jews who were taken to Babylonia and the areas around Iraq were not allowed to go back to their homeland. So he right away said the Jews are allowed to go back to their homeland. And the second thing is he gave the Jews the permission to build the second temple. He right away gave them the permission. And when he gave this permission, many of the Jews went back, led by two people, Ezra, the scribe, and Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the grandson of Yechaniah, the king of Yehuda, who was raised in Bavel. That's why he was called Zerubbabel, seed of Bavel. He was descended from the kings of Judea, but he lived his whole life in Bavel. So him and Ezra led a bunch of Jews back to Eretz Yisrael to start building the Beis Mikdash. But at this point, things started going a little bad. Koresh was very thankful for the Jews and wanted liked the Jews and wanted their God to be kind to his empire, so he gave them the ability to build their temple. In general, Koresh started this doctrine called the doctrine of toleration, which was not followed by all Persian kings, but it was followed by some of them. And it was definitely better than the past kings of major empires in the Middle East, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, which never had this doctrine, which was the concept of after you conquer people, actually treat them well and let them join your government so they won't rebel against it. And also, don't try to destroy any religions and support all these other religions. So all that matters is that they pay taxes. He didn't care what religion you served as long as you paid taxes. And another thing that Koresh had, which was very fascinating, is it was only during his lifetime, but he outlawed slavery throughout all the lands that he conquered. He freed every single slave where he conquered, which is much crazier than it is nowadays. Nowadays, that's completely normal. But if you think back then, in the ancient world, there was nowhere that didn't have slavery. So for Koresh to do that, it was an extreme aberration and very unusual. So anyway, Koresh was killed fighting some tribes in modern-day Kazakhstan, and his son was appointed king. So according to some opinions, as we're going to see here, there's many midrashim, and oftentimes they disagree about what happened. So according to some opinions, Koresh was succeeded directly by Achashverosh. But according to other opinions, and those opinions more align with the secular history, he was not succeeded directly by Achashverosh. It was two people in between, but they were so insignificant that they're not mentioned in the Purim story as very important, and they're not mentioned in Tanakh because they don't affect it that much. So the first king was the first one to inherit it was Cambyses, which was Koresh's son, and he right away conquered Egypt. Right after that, there was a huge revolt, and on his way back, he got killed by Daryavish, who was the other king. who the other king before Achashverosh. Daryavish was Kirish's grandson, according to some opinions. And this is Daryavish the first, not Achashverosh's son, who was Daryavish the second. So Daryavish ended up trying to conquer Greece, conquered some other lands, and then also died. And then Achashverosh became king. So there's many variations on how Achashverosh became king. Some opinions say he was the rightful heir after Daryavish. He was the brother of Cambyses. He was next in line to be king. Some people even say he was the son of Daryavish himself, and he was rightfully to become king. Many opinions, though, hold either that he was a stable boy and he found a huge amount of treasure, bribed his way into importance in the Persian court, and then became king through marrying, through intertwining himself with the Persian royal family. Another opinion was that he was one of the lower members of the royal family, like a distant cousin. And through finding his wealth, he was able to place himself as the most important person in the Persian royal family and become the next king. Either way, according to both opinions, Achashverosh, what was very important was that he had a lot of wealth, and that's his main way of leveraging his importance and becoming king. According to some Gemaras, Achashverosh was one of the few kings throughout history who ruled the entire civilized world. The other people on the list are Alexander, Nebuchadnezzar, and Sancherib. There's very few people who are. Shlomo HaMelech is also one of them. And ruling doesn't mean completely owning them through government. It means having an extreme amount of influence and control over it. So Shlomo HaMelech had it through diplomacy, while Sancherib, the king of Assyria, had it through conquest. Anyway, Achashverosh, as it says right in the beginning of Purim, ruled from Haidu to Kush. Now, what does that mean? That's actually a debate. There's two opinions. The more common and accepted opinion is Haidu is India, and Kush was Ethiopia. So he ruled from Ethiopia all the way to India, a large portion of land. Another opinion is that Haidu to Kush, if you know, in Afghanistan and India, there's these mountains called the Hindu Kush Mountains. Hindu is the name of India, Haidu, and Kush is the name of the mountains on the Afghanistan side. So what does it mean? He only ruled that small portion, India and Afghanistan? Obviously not. So when it says Haidu ad Kush, it means he wrapped around the entire Asia. He ruled the entire land of Asia, the entire continent, all the way that if you went, that it was like Haidu ad Kush. He ruled all the way around. You could go around the entire empire and go back to Haidu ad Kush, and he would still rule it. Anyway, so Achashverosh became king, and he right away made a feast 70 years later. What does it mean? Why did he make a feast? Because he thought the kingdom was from when Yechanya. He thought the 70 years happened from when Yechanya was taken and deposed. So he thought the 70 years were over. So why was he celebrating? First of all, because he feared the Jews a lot more than Kirish. Kirish didn't fear the Jews. He thought that if he acted nice to them, they would be nice to him back. Achashverosh feared them a lot. First of all, Kirish delayed the construction of the second temple when people lied about what the Jews were doing there. There were people known as the Kusim who told Kirish that what the Jews were building there was not a temple, it was a fortress to stand against you. So Kirish stopped the building of the second temple. And the Jews, by the time of Achashverosh, who were happy that the lies and allegations were cleared, they said to them, you saw what the Kusim did was lies. So are you going to let us rebuild the second temple? And Achashverosh said no, because he was a lot more scared of the Jews than Kirish was. And he didn't want the second temple being built. So Achashverosh made the feast in honor that 70 years passed and the Jews weren't going back. The Jews were not going to go back to their lands. So what's interesting is all 70 years had an effect. So what's the interesting thing? The first 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar became king, the Jews, exactly right after Kirish took over, which was the night of 70 years, when when Belshazzar made his feast, is when Koresh ripped up the law that said Jews were not allowed to go back to the land of Israel. So those 70 years, part of the prophecy actually did come to pass. The 70 years when Ahasuerus made his famous feast, also something important happened. It started the chain of events that led to Esther becoming queen and saving the Jewish people. And she had a son named Daryavish, who ended up allowing the Jewish temple to be rebuilt. And the last portion of the 70 years from when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, was when Daryavish, at the end of the day, gave permission for the Beis Hamikdash to start being rebuilt again. So all 70 years, all interpretations of the prophecy were true. It's not the whole truth. They didn't explain all of it. So people were constantly misinterpreting it and thinking it would happen all at once. So Ahasuerus made his feast, but he didn't just make it because the 70 years, the Jews weren't rebuilding the temple and becoming free again. He made it for a couple of reasons. First, one of them was that it was the first year in the Persian Empire, there was a tradition that you waited 3 years till you got crowned. You ruled the first 3 years and you weren't crowned yet. You only became crowned after 3 years of ruling. The second reason is because his navy just defeated a major navy of a rival power who tried attacking him. So he was very happy. So during his feast, he invited a lot of people, many people from throughout the empire. So first he invited his nobles, which were the people who were loyal to him, who got him into power, who he bribed originally. The second people who he invited were his servants, because servants back then meant administrators, because he realized their importance and he needed them to remain loyal to him. So he actually invited them before anyone else. The next people who he invited were the military, but he was very wary of them because they didn't care about money. The military men were oftentimes important of glory, so he had them seated farther. But he showed them the servants right in front of them, because the servants back then were the administrators. So he's like, you military men, you better stay loyal to me or you guys won't get paid. He was showing off how close he was to the servants. The fourth group of people he invited were the people who ran the cities, the mayors and the sheiks of these lands, people who ran all the cities, because that's where he got most of his taxes from. And he wanted to show them, because many times city lords think they're more important than everyone else, so they challenge kings. Why is that? Because they say, the king needs me. I'm the one who gives him all his taxes. So he had the city lords come to show him that I'm wealthy, I don't need you. You better listen to me, because I am completely willing to destroy your city, even if I'll lose a lot of money, because I'm too wealthy for it to make a difference. And the last group he brought was the regional nobles. He's had them seated the farthest away of his party, because he didn't care about them. He wanted to show them that they better not revolt. They don't matter at all to him. He'll just switch them out with some of these other groups, either someone from the military, either a mayor, or either his own servants. He'll appoint them in their place. He wanted to show them how weak they are and how unimportant they are. And because he was so afraid of revolts, as I explained, Ahasuerus was very insecure, either because he was a stable boy or because he was one of the lesser royals. He wasn't he was a distant cousin. He didn't have a lot of importance in the court. So for him to become king, he was very unprecedented, and he was very nervous that there was going to be revolts against him. So he kept on bringing out more and more money to show two things. First of all, that he could fulfill all his obligations to them, that they'd get paid if they were loyal to him. And second of all, that he was friends with all these other groups. So, because the greatest fear for a king is when different groups unite in a revolt. When it's just one group revolting, then you could unite all the other groups against them under your kingly banner. But if it's many groups revolting, it's a lot more difficult to control. So he had all these people come, and it was 150 plus day feast, because the people from the farthest parts of the empire took a long time to get there, because it was so large, and especially in those days. So many people would leave while the feast would continue. At the end of it all, he had a 7-day feast for the people in the city of Shushan, including the Jews. And many people state the reason why he had this feast for the Jews was, first of all, because he was afraid of them, so he wanted to get close to them, just like with everyone else. But the second reason is he wanted to show them that he wanted to see them betray their God. So, because he'd feel comfortable if he's like, the Jewish people don't even believe in their God. Why should I? What am I supposed to be nervous about? To calm him down. That's one of the reasons why he wanted the Jews to come and eat non-kosher food. And that's what ended up happening. Many of the Jews lost all faith because it was 70 years, actually 2 versions of the 70 years, and they didn't feel enough has changed. So they wanted to go, so they stopped believing, and they right away started eating all the food. It was at this time that Achashverosh got married to Vashti just in the beginning of the feast. The feast, one of the reasons why he had the feast was because 150 days earlier in the beginning of the feast, he got married to Vashti. So he was celebrating that. And many of the people, many of the princes around him who didn't like Achashverosh kept on arguing with him. And they were drinking together, and Achashverosh got drunk famously. And they kept on saying that our beauties are much more beautiful than yours. We could marry whoever we want. You, to be legitimate, to be an important ruler, had to marry a princess because you're a lower royal. You had to marry a princess who we don't even know if she looks good. You just had to marry her because of duty and because of force. You had to marry you didn't marry someone that you loved. You had to marry someone based on political convenience. So Achashverosh right away got very nervous about this. So he to get validation from the nobles said, "I'll prove you wrong. Vashti is very beautiful." He told her to come out so that everyone would see her. So many people ask, what's the big deal with Vashti coming out? So there's 2 interpretations. Either she was extremely arrogant because she was a princess, or when Achashverosh told her to come out, he didn't just tell her to come out. He told her to come out completely naked to prove how beautiful she was. So of course Vashti, who was from a royal family, would not want to do that. She had too much dignity. She wouldn't want to do that. But she was a very cruel person. So don't feel too much sympathy for her. She wanted only Jewish maidens to serve her, and then she would act extremely cruel to them and force them to work grueling hours and not get paid. So, because she remembered that her father and her grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had an extreme hatred for the Jews, so she inherited it. Anyway, she said she's not coming, and at this point, Achashverosh was feeling very uncomfortable because the nobles in his area were saying he can't even control his own wife. She really is not beautiful. They probably planned this out together, or she's beautiful, but she doesn't respect him at all because he's not even an important royal. She's the daughter of a king. He's not even important. So Achashverosh was getting very nervous and a bit furious. And this is exactly when Haman knew that he'd have the greatest chance to be important, to take advantage of the king's emotions and become important. So that's when he told Achashverosh to kill Vashti. It was during that scenario that he told Achashverosh to kill Vashti. And what happened next is we know the famous selection of wives and how Esther ended up being chosen, and how Haman, because of his importance, told Achashverosh to kill the Jews. And Achashverosh already didn't like the Jews, and at this point he wasn't afraid of them either. So he said, "Of course, Haman, 70 years passed. You could do whatever you want. I like you. I don't really care about the Jews." And famously, what ended up happening is Haman getting hung on the tree, and then Daryavish ended up becoming the king afterwards. And Daryavish creating the Beis Hamikdash, allowing the Beis Hamikdash to be built, because even though he married a non-Jew, he still remembered that his mother was Jewish, so he ended up building the Beis Hamikdash. Does anyone have any questions on the history of this portion? Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, then I'll continue.
Hello, Rabbi.
Yes.
Just for the purposes of completion, it's a big jump to this. Could you just indicate, however so briefly, what happened that led Ahasuerus' realization that Haman needed to be hung, that he was part of a plot. Could you just briefly go over that? Because it was a big jump from the last.
Of course. I thought everyone knew the. Yes, of
Well,
course.
we do, but the way you're doing it, it's so great. I mean, I want to just really have it, laid out for everybody.
All right. So what ended up happening is Achashverosh was very loyal to Haman, but he, as I explained, he was very unsure of himself and he lacked self-confidence. So he got very nervous how Haman was running everything. And he started wondering, he was already afraid of Haman. It was at that point that Achashverosh remembered the story, the famous story of how what's it called? How Mordechai saved his life. And from Big Son and Seresh, and he right away knew that he wanted to test Haman. So how did he test him? He said, what should I do for the man the king most wishes to honor? And at that point, Haman had no doubt that it was him, because Achashverosh kept on honoring him over and over again. So when Haman stated that he wanted to wear the crown of the king, ride on the king's horse and wear the king's clothes, Achashverosh thought that Haman would try to betray him. And just because he thought of everyone as underhanded as he was. So what ended up happening is that Achashverosh already started not trusting Haman, but he couldn't kill Haman outright. He was a coward with his own court. So he only let the Jews the right he hung Haman, but he only let the Jews the right to fight all the other people who wanted to kill the Jews on the 13th of Adar. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a great day.
Rabbi?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.